Daniel Mercer has been dead for 7 years. So why is his dog tag still warm? Staff Sergeant Caleb Hayes does not say the question aloud. He cannot. The words have lodged somewhere beneath his ribs, where old guilt and older prayers have learned to live without being named. He kneels in the center aisle of St. Michael's Chapel, one hand braced against a warped wooden pew, the other held open beneath the narrow beam of his flashlight. Rain strikes the roof in slow, hollow waves. Wind presses against the stained glass windows, making the faded figures tremble in their frames. The chapel smells of wet pine, cold stone, and candle wax. Not old wax. Fresh wax. Somewhere nearby, a flame has burned within the last hour. Caleb lowers his eyes to the small oval of metal resting in his palm. The edges are worn smooth. The chain is broken. Mud darkens one corner, but the stamped letters remain clear. Daniel J. Mercer, USMC. Caleb knows every mark on that tag. He has seen its twin sealed inside a flag case at Daniel's memorial. He has stood before that case each November, shoulders straight, jaw locked, while men around him spoke about honor, sacrifice, and closure. Closure. The word has always sounded like a door being shut while someone is still calling from the other side. Beside him, Ranger stands perfectly still. The German shepherd is soaked from muzzle to tail, his sable coat almost black beneath the rainwater, his chest rising in measured breaths. He does not whine. He does not pace. His amber eyes remain fixed on the floorboards beneath the altar. A thin scar crosses the tip of his left ear, pale against the dark fur. Caleb noticed it the moment the dog appeared on the mountain road. He noticed the scar, the posture, the way Ranger watched him not like a stray begging for help, but like a soldier waiting for another soldier to understand. Now, inside the abandoned chapel, that same look has changed. There is urgency in it, and fear, not the wild fear of an animal trapped in a storm. Something quieter, something disciplined. Ranger knows someone is here. Caleb closes his fingers around the tag. Warmth lingers against his skin, not the faint warmth metal takes. From a pocket. This is deeper, almost human, as though someone held it tightly before letting go. He turns toward the chapel doors. They hang partly open, swaying an inch with every gust. Beyond them, rain washes the steps and disappears into the black trees. No headlights glow through the woods. No footprints remain on the stone path. Whoever left the tag could not have gone far. Daniel. Caleb's voice comes out low and uneven. The name moves through the chapel and returns as a broken echo. Daniel. 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 Ranger's ears lift. Caleb waits. Only the storm answers. Water taps through a leak near the choir loft. A loose shutter knocks against the wall. Somewhere in the rafters, an old beam settles with a tired groan. Caleb rises slowly. His knees ache from the cold. At 38, he still carries the broad frame of a Marine, but time has drawn faint lines beside his gray-blue eyes, and too many sleepless nights have hollowed the face beneath his close-cropped brown hair. He wears no uniform now, just a dark field jacket, faded jeans, and boots already covered in red mountain clay. But the way he scans the room has never left him. Door, windows, corners, exits, threats, hope. Hope is the one thing he has never learned to assess. His flashlight moves across rows of dusty pews. Most have not been touched in years. Yet a narrow path through the center aisle is clean, the dust disturbed by recent steps. Near the altar sits a metal bowl half filled with water. Beside it lies a heel of bread on a folded piece of brown paper. One portion for a man, one for a dog. Caleb looks at Ranger. The shepherd does not glance toward the food. He takes one careful step toward the altar and stops. His nails click once against the stone. Then he lowers his head. "What do you hear, boy?" Caleb whispers. Ranger's nose moves along the seam where stone meets wood. He breathes in slowly, then looks back at Caleb. There it is again. That silent command. Follow me. Trust me. Caleb feels the old resistance rise inside him. 7 years ago, trust had been measured in seconds, coordinates, and radio calls swallowed by static. 7 years ago, he followed in order to leave a place Daniel never walked out of. The official report said no one could have survived. The search lasted 3 days. Caleb argued for 4. He has spent every year since wondering whether one more hour would have changed everything. Ranger steps closer to the altar. A faint sound moves beneath the floor. Caleb freezes. The storm seems to draw back, as if the whole mountain has stopped to listen. At first, he thinks it is water running beneath the foundation. Then it comes again. 3 slow knocks. Not random. Not the shifting of old wood. Knock. 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 Ranger presses his chest to the floor and releases one low breath through his nose. Caleb's hand tightens around the warm dog tag. "Daniel," he says again, louder now. For one suspended second, nothing answers. Then, beneath the boards, something scrapes weakly against stone. Caleb drops to his knees. He places his palm against the floor. Cold wood. A faint vibration. Life. Ranger turns toward him, rainwater still falling from his coat onto the dusty boards. And in the dog's eyes, Caleb sees no confusion, no surprise, only the fierce certainty of a promise that has survived weather, distance, and time. Somewhere below them, the knocking stops. Caleb leans closer to the floor and hears a breath that should not exist. 6 hours earlier, he had believed the dead stayed buried in memory. Now an old chapel, a silent German shepherd, and one warm piece of metal are about to prove him wrong. 6 hours earlier, Caleb Hayes had been driving west through the Blue Ridge Mountains with the heater turned low and the silence turned all the way up. The memorial service had ended before noon, but the weight of it still sat beside him like an unseen passenger. Every November, the same polished shoes crossed the same church floor. The same folded flag rested beneath the same brass plaque. The same men spoke carefully about sacrifice, honor, and peace. Caleb listened. He shook hands. He stood straight when Daniel Mercer's name was read. Then he left before anyone could ask why he never stayed for coffee. Rain had followed him out of town, first as a mist, then as a steady gray curtain that softened the hills and erased the distant ridgelines. His truck moved along the narrow two-lane road at 35 miles per hour, tires whispering over wet pavement. Pine trees crowded both shoulders. Fallen leaves clung to the ditches in copper and dark red layers. The air coming through a crack in the window smelled of wet bark, cold soil, and wood smoke from homes hidden somewhere beyond the trees. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel. On the passenger seat lay a small black case containing the medal he had received after Daniel disappeared. He had carried it to the memorial because Daniel's mother once asked him to. He had never opened it in public. The medal felt less like recognition and more like a question no one else could hear. At mile marker 17, Caleb saw the dog. The German shepherd stood on the gravel shoulder beneath a bent road sign, rain collecting along the dark ridge of his back. He was large, lean, and motionless. His sable coat faded from black along the spine to deep brown around the chest and legs. One ear stood perfectly upright. The other bore a thin scar near the tip. His amber eyes followed the truck as it approached. Caleb eased off the accelerator. The dog did not step away. Most strays either ran from an engine or moved toward it with hopeful confusion. This one did neither. He watched. Caleb passed him by nearly 50 feet before something in his chest tightened. He checked the mirror. The shepherd remained beside the marker, facing the truck. 17. Caleb knew it was only a number painted on metal. Still, Patrol 17 had been Daniel's final assignment. Caleb stopped on the shoulder and sat with the engine idling. Rain clicked against the windshield. He told himself not to turn around. He had spent 7 years learning not to follow every coincidence into the past. Then the dog stepped into the road and sat directly behind the truck. Caleb closed his eyes for one breath. "Of course you did," he murmured. He shifted into reverse and rolled back slowly until the shepherd appeared beside his window. Up close, Caleb saw that the animal wore a weathered leather collar. There was no identification plate, no county license. Only a narrow strip of faded blue cloth. Tied near the buckle, the fabric had once been bright, perhaps cut from a bandana or field marker, but time and rain had reduced it to a soft, frayed ribbon. Caleb stared at it longer than he meant to. Daniel used to tie blue cloth around the handle of his gear bags so no one would mistake them in the dark. He claimed blue was easier to see through dust. Caleb had teased him about it for years. The dog rose. He took 4 steps toward the tree line, stopped, and looked back. Caleb lowered the window farther. "You belong to somebody?" The shepherd turned toward the woods again. No bark, no wagging tail, just a quiet expectation. Caleb looked down the road. No houses, no parked vehicles, no sound beyond the rain and the distant rush of water moving through a drainage creek. He reached for his phone. The screen showed no service. When he looked up again, the dog had moved another 10 yards into the trees. Only his face remained visible between two wet trunks. Caleb should have called animal control from the next town. He should have continued home, warmed a can of soup, and let the day end without another ghost entering it. Instead, he shut off the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and deep. He pulled on his dark field jacket, placed the truck keys in his pocket, and stepped into the rain. Cold water struck his face. Mud softened beneath his boots. The shepherd waited until Caleb crossed the ditch, then moved forward along a trail almost hidden by ferns and fallen branches. "I am giving you 5 minutes," Caleb said. The dog glanced back as if 5 minutes had never meant anything to him. They climbed steadily through the forest. The trail narrowed, rising over roots and flat stones glazed with rain. Caleb estimated they had gone half a mile when the road disappeared completely behind them. Every few minutes, the shepherd stopped to test the air. He would lower his nose near a tree, listen, then look back to confirm Caleb was still there. His movements were too measured for a lost pet. There was training in them. Discipline. Purpose. Caleb began noticing other signs. A broken branch at shoulder height. A partial boot print filled with fresh water. A small place beneath a cedar where someone had recently rested. Beside the roots lay a piece of brown paper damp around the edges and a crumb of bread untouched by insects. Someone had passed through these woods that morning, perhaps within the hour. The thought should have made Caleb cautious. Instead, it awakened something he had tried to bury, the old instinct to keep moving when another life might be waiting ahead. The shepherd suddenly froze. His ears lifted. Far beyond the trees, a bell sounded once. Low, hollow, almost swallowed by the storm. Caleb looked toward the dog. "There is no church up here." The shepherd continued walking. Another quarter-mile passed before the forest opened onto a narrow clearing. At its far edge stood a small stone chapel with a sagging roof, dark windows, and a wooden cross silvered by age. Ivy covered one wall. The front doors hung slightly open. A pale thread of smoke rose from a chimney that should have been cold. The German shepherd stopped at the edge of the clearing. For the first time, his composure faltered. His chest rose faster. His gaze fixed on the open doorway, and a soft sound escaped him, not fear, not warning, but recognition. Caleb felt the reins slide down the back of his neck. "Who is in there, boy?" The dog looked at him. Then he ran toward the chapel as if he had finally reached the place where waiting ended. Caleb crossed the clearing at a run, boots slipping once in the wet grass before finding solid ground again. Ranger reached the chapel first and pushed his shoulder against the half-open door. The hinges answered with a long, tired groan. A current of cold air moved out from the darkness, carrying the scent of damp wood, old stone, and something faintly sweet. Candle wax. Caleb slowed at the threshold. Rainwater rolled from his jacket sleeves and gathered at his fingertips. Ranger stood 3 feet inside, body low, eyes fixed beyond the rows of pews. He did not enter farther until Caleb stepped beside him. That small act unsettled Caleb more than any bark could have. The dog had brought him here, but now he was asking permission to continue. "All right," Caleb whispered. Together, Ranger moved forward. Their footsteps passed through the chapel in different rhythms, Caleb's boots heavy against the stone aisle, Ranger's nails touching lightly between them. The room was smaller than it had appeared from outside. 12 narrow pews faced a plain wooden altar. Faded blue glass filled the windows, turning the gray afternoon into a dim underwater light. On the left wall hung a wooden plaque darkened by age. Most of the lettering had worn away, but Caleb could still read the name St. Michael and a date from more than 80 years earlier. Water tapped steadily into a rusted bucket near the back wall. Somewhere above them, the wind breathed through a gap in the roof. Ranger paused beside the third pew and lifted his nose. Caleb swept his flashlight across the floor. Dust covered most of the stone, yet a thin trail through the center aisle had been disturbed. A heel mark, the edge of a boot, fresh mud drying in a narrow crescent. Someone had entered before them. Caleb felt the old part of himself return without invitation. He checked the side door, the choir loft, the narrow space behind the altar. His breathing slowed. His senses widened. For years he had tried to convince himself that training faded when a man stopped wearing the uniform. It did not. It merely waited. Ranger glanced back at him, And for a moment, Caleb remembered another dog in another place. Years earlier, standing beside Daniel Mercer beneath a white sky. Daniel had always trusted animals before maps. He said a map only knew where the ground had been, but a dog knew what had crossed it. Caleb used to laugh at that. Daniel used to laugh louder. The memory came warm at first, then sharpened. 7 years earlier, a radio call had broken through the static just before dusk. Weather closing in. Visibility failing. Command ordered Patrol 17 to pull back. Caleb had repeated the order twice. Daniel had answered once, calm and clear, saying he was less than a mile behind them. Caleb waited 4 minutes beyond the limit he had been given. Then 6. Then 9. The rest of the team was exhausted. The road was disappearing under rain, and the final command left no room for argument. Caleb led them out. Daniel never reached the checkpoint. No one accused Caleb of abandoning him. That made it worse. The report said he had followed procedure. His commanding officer called the decision responsible. Daniel's family thanked him for bringing the others home. Every word of forgiveness became another stone Caleb carried. He had obeyed. He had survived. He had never stopped hearing the silence that followed Daniel's last transmission. Ranger moved again, drawing Caleb back into the chapel. The shepherd stopped beside the altar and lowered his nose to a folded piece of brown paper. 2 pieces of bread rested there. One had been torn in half. The other remained whole, set beside a metal bowl of water. Caleb touched the paper. It was dry despite the damp air. Recent. A short candle stood behind it, its wick black and soft. He held 2 fingers above the wax. A trace of warmth remained. Somebody was here, he said. Ranger's ears turned toward the right side of the room. Caleb followed his gaze to a narrow door built into the wall near the altar. It opened into what had once been a small room for the minister. Inside stood a cot, a wool blanket, a lantern, and a pair of worn boots. A dark green field jacket hung from a wooden peg. Caleb stepped closer. The jacket was old, but clean. On one sleeve, nearly hidden beneath careful stitching, was the pale outline where a military patch had once been removed. His chest tightened. He reached toward it, then stopped. Ranger entered the room and sniffed the cot. His tail lowered. He pressed his nose into the blanket and inhaled once, deeply, as though finding a scent he had crossed mountains to remember. Then he turned and looked directly at Caleb. The faded blue cloth on his collar trembled with each breath. Caleb finally understood why the color had felt familiar. It was not merely like the markers Daniel used. It was one of them. He had tied strips from the same cloth around every field bag, every radio case, and once around the collar of a young German shepherd he had promised to train when they returned home. Caleb took one careful step toward Ranger. You knew him. The dog's eyes did not leave his. Outside, the chapel bell sounded again, though no hand touched the rope. Ranger suddenly turned toward the main room. His body went still. From somewhere beyond the altar came a soft metallic sound, small enough to be missed beneath the rain. Something had fallen beneath the final pew. Caleb raised his flashlight. Ranger moved first, not running now, but walking with the solemn certainty of a witness approaching the truth. Ranger stopped beside the final pew and lowered his head. The metallic sound had been small, almost delicate, yet it seemed to linger beneath the rain like the last note of a hymn. Caleb approached slowly, directing the flashlight toward the floor. Dust lay thick around the pew legs, gray and undisturbed except for one narrow line that curved beneath the bench. It looked as though something attached to a chain had been pulled across the stone. Ranger placed one paw near the mark, then looked toward the wall behind the altar. Caleb followed his gaze. A strip of pale light showed beneath a heavy curtain he had not noticed before. Stay close, he said. The words came naturally, though he was no longer certain which of them was protecting the other. He moved the curtain aside and found a shallow passage running behind the sanctuary. The space was barely 3 feet wide, framed by rough stone on one side and old wooden panels on the other. Cold air touched his face. It smelled of earth, rainwater, and the faint smoke of a recently extinguished fire. Ranger entered first, nose close to the floor. Caleb turned sideways to follow. The passage ended at a small wooden door with an iron latch. A cross had been carved into the center, not with the careful hand of a craftsman, but with the point of a pocket knife. Beneath it were 4 words. Keep the light burning. Caleb brushed his thumb over the letters. The cuts were newer than the door. Rain had darkened the wood around them, but the grooves remained clean. He lifted the latch. Behind the door was a narrow storage room containing a stack of hymnals, 2 empty kerosene cans, and a wooden crate filled with canned food. The labels were current. A wool cap rested on top, still damp along the edge. Someone had been living in St. Michael's Chapel, and that person had left recently enough for the room to remember his warmth. Ranger sniffed the cap, then stepped back. His ears tilted forward. Caleb watched the dog's expression soften for half a second. Recognition again. Not curiosity. Not uncertainty. Ranger knew the scent. On a shelf above the crate, Caleb found a framed photograph turned face down. He lifted it carefully. Moisture had warped the corners, but the image remained visible. 3 Marines stood beside a training field under a cloudless Carolina sky. Caleb recognized himself before he recognized the others. He was younger, his face unlined, his smile unguarded. Daniel stood beside him with one hand raised against the sunlight. At their feet sat a German shepherd barely more than a year old, ears too large for his head, a strip of bright blue cloth tied around his collar. Caleb looked down at Ranger. The scar on the left ear was absent in the photograph, but the eyes were the same. Amber. Steady. Patient. It is you, Caleb whispered. Ranger moved closer and touched his nose to the glass. Caleb's throat tightened. Daniel had spoken about adopting the dog after their service ended. He had even chosen a name, Ranger, because the animal always searched beyond the place he had been sent. Caleb had forgotten that conversation, or perhaps he had buried it with everything else that hurt too much to carry. A gust moved through the chapel, and the curtain behind them lifted. The bell sounded overhead. One hollow note rolled through the stone room. Caleb returned to the sanctuary with the photograph in his hand. Ranger moved toward the final pew again. This time he crawled beneath it and began pushing his nose against the floor. Caleb knelt beside him. The beam of the flashlight caught a thin silver chain looped around the rear leg of the bench. One end disappeared beneath a loose board. Caleb set the photograph down and pulled gently. The chain resisted. Ranger placed his paw against the board and scraped once. Caleb wedged his fingers into the narrow gap. The wood lifted with a soft groan, releasing a breath of colder air from below. The chain came free. Something small slid across the stone and stopped against Caleb's boot. A military identification tag. He stared at it without touching it. Mud covered part of the surface, but one edge reflected the candlelight that no longer burned. Ranger remained completely still. Caleb reached down and lifted the tag by its chain. The metal settled into his palm. He expected it to feel as cold as the floor. Instead, warmth moved into his skin. Not imagined warmth. Not the warmth of his own hand. Someone had been holding it moments earlier. Caleb wiped away the mud with his thumb. The first name appeared. Daniel. His breath stopped. The second name emerged beneath it. Mercer. Outside, thunder rolled beyond the ridge, low and distant. Caleb turned toward the open chapel doors, expecting a figure in the rain, but the clearing remained empty. Daniel, he called. No answer came from the trees. Ranger did not look toward the entrance. He looked beneath the altar. Then, from somewhere below the chapel floor, 3 slow knocks rose through the silence. Caleb remained on his knees, the identification tag resting in his palm, while the final echo faded beneath the chapel floor. Ranger moved first. He crossed the aisle in 3 quick steps and pressed his nose against the wooden panels beneath the altar. His breath came faster now, but he still did not bark. Caleb followed and lowered the flashlight. The boards were old, darkened by decades of damp air, yet one section carried fresh scratches near the bottom edge. He placed his hand against it. Nothing moved. Daniel, he called again. The name returned from the stone walls, softer each time, until the chapel swallowed it. Ranger turned toward the narrow minister's room, then back toward Caleb. The dog seemed torn between 2 scents. Caleb rose and followed him into the small room. The wool blanket on the cot had been folded with military precision. A metal cup sat on the floor beside it. Near the pillow lay a weathered journal bound with twine, and beneath the journal was a small handheld recorder, the kind sold in office stores years ago. Caleb picked it up. A strip of blue cloth had been tied around the battery cover. His thumb hovered above the play button. For a moment, he was afraid of what he might hear. The dead belonged to memory. Memory could be softened, rearranged, even forgiven. A voice could not. Ranger sat beside the cot and watched him. Caleb pressed play. Static filled the room. Then a man breathed close to the microphone. "My name is Daniel James Mercer." Caleb's knees nearly gave beneath him. The voice was older, rougher, but unmistakable. He had heard it through radios, across crowded barracks, and beside campfires when sleep would not come. He had heard it laughing. He had heard it promise that everything would be all right. "If this recording is found," Daniel continued, "the chapel is no longer safe. The lower room floods when the creek rises, and the western wall has started to shift. I have kept supplies here for anyone passing through. There is food in the storage room and clean water beneath the altar." The recording clicked softly. Daniel paused long enough for Caleb to hear rain in the background, perhaps from another night much like this one. "Caleb, if Ranger brought you here," then he remembered what I asked him to do. Caleb lowered the recorder, but the voice continued. "I do not know how much you were told. I do not know what you believe happened to me. There are parts one still cannot put together. Roads, hospital rooms, names that did not feel like mine. For a long time, I remembered the dog before I remembered myself." Ranger gave a quiet breath and leaned closer to the recorder. Daniel's voice softened. "He found me once before. I thought that was the miracle. I was wrong. The miracle was that he kept looking after I became too tired to be found." Caleb closed his eyes. Each word entered a place that had been sealed for 7 years. He wanted to speak back, to explain the search, the orders, the weather, the thousands of nights he had replayed those final minutes. But the recorder offered no room for defense. Only truth. "If he chose you," Daniel said, "trust him. He always knows when someone is still worth saving." Static rose. A scrape sounded in the background. Daniel drew a shallow breath. "There is something beneath the last pew. Take it. You will understand." The message stopped. Caleb pressed play again, but the machine had reached the end. He stood in silence, the recorder in one hand and the warm identification tag in the other. Ranger touched his nose to Caleb's wrist. "He knew I would come," Caleb whispered. The words did not feel like comfort. They felt like responsibility. He opened the journal. The first pages contained dates from nearly 3 years earlier. Some entries were steady and clear. Others wandered through fragments of memory. Daniel wrote about waking in unfamiliar towns, working seasonal jobs, and following the sound of church bells because they seemed to lead him towards something he had forgotten. He wrote about a German shepherd appearing outside a shelter in Tennessee and refusing to leave. On the next page, one sentence had been underlined twice. "Ranger remembered me before I remembered him." Caleb turned toward the final entry. The handwriting had grown faint. "The rain has returned. My strength is leaving faster now. Ranger went for help. I pray he finds the right man." Beneath those words, Daniel had drawn a simple cross and written one name. Caleb. A sudden crack sounded under the chapel. The floor shifted less than an inch, but dust fell from the altar cloth. Ranger sprang up and rushed toward the center aisle. Caleb followed. The dog stopped over a section of floor between the altar and the final pew, lowered his body, and listened. 3 knocks came again, weaker than before. Then a voice rose through the boards, thin and distant, yet alive. "Ranger." The shepherd released one broken cry and pressed both paws against the floor. Caleb dropped beside him. "Daniel, this is Caleb. I am here." Silence held for one unbearable second. Then the voice below answered. "You finally came back." For a moment, Caleb could not move. The voice beneath the floor was weak, changed by years and exhaustion, but it carried the same quiet steadiness he remembered from long nights on watch. Ranger pressed his chest against the boards and trembled from nose to tail. It was the first time Caleb had seen the dog lose control. "Daniel," Caleb said, leaning close to the floor, "keep talking to me." A faint breath answered. Then came a soft scrape below. "Hard to talk," Daniel said. "Water is coming in." Caleb turned his flashlight across the floor. The boards near the altar were darker than the rest. Moisture pushed through the seams in thin, shining lines. Outside, the storm had deepened. Rain struck the roof harder now, and somewhere behind the chapel, the creek roared through the trees with a force that had not been there an hour earlier. Caleb rose and moved quickly to the minister's room. He took the lantern, the wool blanket, and a length of rope coiled beside the storage crate. Ranger followed, but kept looking back toward the place where Daniel's voice had come from. "I know," Caleb told him. "We are not leaving him." The words carried more weight than a simple promise. Caleb felt them reach backward through 7 years, through one retreat, one unanswered radio, and one decision he had never forgiven himself for making. He returned to the altar and examined the floor. The loose board where the chain had been hidden was too narrow to reach through. He searched the walls, the pews, and the base of the sanctuary, looking for hinges, handles, anything built for access. Ranger sniffed along the western wall, then scratched once at a faded section of paneling. Caleb pulled the curtain aside and found an iron ring set low into the wood. He gripped it and pulled. Nothing happened. He planted one boot against the stone and tried again. The panel shifted half an inch, releasing a breath of cold air and the smell of flooded earth. A narrow stairway descended into darkness. "Found it," Caleb called. Below, Daniel did not answer. Ranger moved toward the opening, but Caleb placed one hand against his chest. "Wait." The dog resisted for only a second, then sat, muscles tight beneath his wet coat. Caleb tied one end of the rope around a support beam near the altar and looped the other around his waist. He lifted the lantern and stepped onto the first stair. The wood bent beneath his weight, but held. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Water ran down the walls and over the steps, cold against his boots. 10 feet below, the stairway ended in a low stone room. The lantern light revealed shelves, broken crates, and water already several inches deep across the floor. Daniel lay near the far wall on a raised wooden platform, one arm resting across his chest. His face was pale beneath a gray beard, and his dark hair had grown long at the sides. He wore the green field jacket Caleb had seen upstairs. One boot was missing. Beside him lay a small wooden box and an old flashlight with a dying beam. Caleb stopped breathing for one full second. Daniel had aged, but he was real. Not a photograph. Not a voice from a recorder. Real. "You look terrible," Caleb said, because anything gentler might have broken him. Daniel opened his eyes. A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. "You always were bad at reunions." Caleb crossed the water and knelt beside him. Daniel's hands were cold. His breathing was shallow, but steady. "Can you stand?" Caleb asked. Daniel tried to move and winced. "Not far." Caleb looked toward the stairs. The water had risen to his ankles. Mud pushed through a crack near the western wall. The storm was filling the room faster than he had expected. Above them, Ranger barked once. The sound echoed down the passage, sharp and urgent. Daniel's eyes lifted. He came back. "He found me first," Caleb said. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "That sounds like him." Caleb wrapped the blanket around Daniel's shoulders and secured the rope beneath his arms. "I am going to get you out." Daniel looked at him carefully, as though measuring the years between them. "You already did once." Caleb shook his head. "No, I followed an order. You brought the others home. I left you behind." Daniel's expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition. "Caleb, I heard your voice on the radio until the battery died. You kept calling." The words struck deeper than accusation ever could. Caleb looked away. Water moved around his boots in widening circles. "I should have stayed. Then 2 men would have disappeared," Daniel said. "Maybe more." Caleb tightened the rope. "We can settle this upstairs." Daniel gave the faintest laugh, still giving orders. A deep groan moved through the chapel foundation. Dust fell from the ceiling. Ranger barked again, then began clawing at the top step. Caleb pulled the rope once to test it. Secure. He helped Daniel rise, taking most of his weight. Daniel's legs shook, but he remained standing. Together they crossed the flooded room. At the foot of the stairs, Daniel stopped and looked back toward the small wooden box. "The letters," he said. Caleb followed his gaze. "What letters?" "For the families. For the men who thought I forgot them." The water reached the lower edge of the platform. Caleb had seconds to choose. He eased Daniel against the wall, crossed back, and took the box. It was heavier than it looked. When he returned, Ranger's front paws appeared at the top of the stairway. The shepherd whined and stretched his neck downward. Daniel raised one trembling hand. Ranger became still. Daniel formed 2 fingers and moved them gently toward his chest, an old silent command. "Come." Ranger descended without hesitation. He reached Daniel, pressed his head against the man's heart, and closed his eyes. Daniel rested his hand between the dog's ears. "Good boy," he whispered. Then the western wall gave another warning groan, and cold water rushed across the floor. The cold water swept across the stone floor and climbed above Caleb's boots in seconds. Ranger braced himself beside Daniel, his paws spread wide, his body pressed against the man's legs as if he could hold both the water and the years back by force of loyalty alone. Caleb seized the rope and pulled it tight. "We move now," he said. Daniel nodded, but his face had gone pale beneath the lantern light. Caleb placed the wooden box beneath one arm, wrapped the other around Daniel's waist, and guided him toward the stairs. The first step was already hidden beneath the rising water. Ranger climbed ahead, then turned and waited, refusing to leave more than a few feet between himself and Daniel. Caleb lifted Daniel's foot onto the next stair. "One step at a time." "I remember you saying that before," Daniel whispered. "When? A long time ago. Different rain." Caleb did not ask for more. The past could wait. The water could not. They climbed slowly. Daniel's strength faded with each step, and Caleb took more of his weight until the man seemed almost suspended between the rope and Caleb's shoulder. Above them, the chapel groaned as wind pushed against the old walls. Dust drifted through the opening like gray snow. Ranger reached the top and began pulling at the rope with his teeth, adding whatever strength he had. "Easy boy," Caleb said. "Keep steady." The shepherd understood. He stepped backward, careful and controlled, keeping tension on the line. Halfway up, Daniel's boot slipped. Caleb tightened his grip before either man lost balance. The wooden box struck the wall, and its lid opened. Several envelopes slid onto the wet steps. Each one bore a name written in Daniel's careful hand. Families, friends, men who had waited for answers. Caleb gathered them quickly, pressing the damp paper against his chest. Daniel looked down at them with quiet fear. "Do not leave those." "I will not. Promise me." Caleb met his eyes. "Nothing gets left behind tonight." Daniel studied him for 1 second, then nodded. They continued. The water followed, spilling over each lower step, cold and dark. Ranger pulled. Caleb lifted. Daniel climbed. No one spoke until Caleb reached the final stair and pushed Daniel onto the chapel floor. Ranger immediately moved beside him, pressing his warm body against Daniel's ribs. Caleb hauled the wooden box through the opening, then pulled the concealed panel shut just as water reached the top step. The iron ring rattled once and became still. For several breaths, all three remained on the floor beneath the altar. Rain thundered overhead. The lantern flame trembled. Daniel's hand rested on Ranger's neck, fingers buried in the wet fur. Ranger closed his eyes, but his ears remained alert. Caleb looked at the man beside him and tried to reconcile the living face with the memorial photograph he had carried in his mind for 7 years. Daniel was thinner. His beard was streaked with gray. Time had changed the shape of him, but not the calm in his eyes. "How long have you been here?" Caleb asked. Daniel stared toward the faded blue windows. "Long enough to know every sound this place makes." "That is not an answer." 3 months, maybe 4. "And before that?" Daniel's expression clouded. "Pieces. A clinic in Kentucky. A shelter in Tennessee. Work on a horse farm outside Bristol. Some days are clear. Others are rooms without doors." Ranger lifted his head at the word shelter. Daniel gave the dog a tired smile. "He found me there. Sat outside the fence every morning until I remembered his name." Caleb looked at the blue cloth tied to Ranger's collar. "Then why come here?" "The bell." Daniel turned toward the tower. "I heard it in a dream for years. When I finally found the chapel, something inside me settled. I thought memory would return if I waited." "Did it?" Daniel looked at him. "Enough to remember who I disappointed." Caleb lowered his gaze to the identification tag still clasped in his fist. "You did not disappoint anyone. I disappeared. You survived." Sometimes those feel like the same thing. A gust struck the doors, pushing one wider. Rain blew across the threshold. Caleb stood and crossed the aisle to close them, but Ranger suddenly rose and moved toward the entrance. He sniffed the air, then looked back. The trail through the woods was flooding. Water crossed the clearing in shining ribbons, and the creek's roar had grown louder. St. Michael's Chapel was no longer safe. Caleb checked his phone. Still no signal. His truck sat nearly a mile away through darkness and heavy rain. Daniel could not make that walk unaided. On the wall beside the doors hung an old wooden sign bearing a faded map of the property. Caleb raised the lantern. A narrow line led from the chapel to a caretaker's cabin on higher ground, less than a quarter mile east. "There," he said. We can reach that cabin. Daniel tried to stand and nearly sank back. Caleb caught his arm. Ranger stepped beneath Daniel's hand, offering his back as support. The man looked down at the shepherd, and something gentle passed between them. Not command, not memory, gratitude. Caleb secured the rope around Daniel again and tied the wooden box across his own back. He opened the chapel door. Wind and rain filled the room. Beyond the steps, the clearing had become a moving sheet of silver beneath the storm. Ranger went first, testing the ground. Before every step, Daniel leaned against Caleb, weak but upright. As they left St. Michael's, the bell sounded once above them. This time, none of them mistook it for the wind. Rain struck Caleb's face as he guided Daniel down the chapel steps. The ground beyond had become slick and uneven, the grass flattened beneath shallow streams of water moving toward the creek. Ranger stayed several feet ahead, nose low, testing each patch of earth before looking back. The wooden box on Caleb's back shifted with every step, its damp envelopes pressed against his shoulder blades. Daniel leaned heavily against him, one arm around Caleb's neck, the other resting on Ranger whenever the shepherd moved close enough to help. The caretaker's cabin stood somewhere beyond the eastern tree line, less than a quarter-mile away, but the storm had turned that distance into a long, uncertain crossing. "Still with me?" Caleb asked. Daniel gave a faint nod. "I have been trying to catch up for 7 years." Caleb tightened his grip. "Then do not stop now." They moved through the clearing one careful step at a time. Water filled Caleb's boots. Wind pulled at his jacket. Ranger paused near a fallen branch, sniffed once, then chose a narrow rise between two maple trees. Caleb followed without question. The dog no longer needed to ask for trust. He had earned it with every mile, every silent warning, and every moment he refused to give up on the man behind them. Beneath the trees, the rain softened slightly, though droplets still fell in heavy bursts from the leaves. The forest smelled of wet bark, crushed fern, and cold mountain soil. Daniel stumbled once. Caleb caught him before he went down. Ranger immediately returned and stood against Daniel's knees, giving him something solid to lean on. Daniel placed both hands on the shepherd's shoulders. "You got older," he whispered. Ranger turned his head and touched his nose to Daniel's wrist. "So did I," Daniel added. Caleb looked away, giving them the privacy of silence. Some reunions did not need witnesses. They needed room. A faint light appeared through the trees. At first, Caleb thought it was lightning trapped in the rain, but it remained. Steady, amber and low. The caretaker's cabin. Its porch sagged slightly toward one side, and moss covered much of the roof, but smoke rose from a narrow chimney. Caleb stopped. "Someone is there." Ranger's ears lifted. He did not growl. Instead, he moved forward with calm recognition. Before they reached the steps, the door opened. An elderly man stood beneath the porch light wearing a brown sweater and suspenders, his white hair flattened on one side, as though he had been sleeping in a chair. He held a lantern in one hand and a walking stick in the other. His eyes moved from Caleb to Daniel, then to Ranger. The lantern lowered. "Merciful heaven," he said. "Daniel." Daniel raised his head. "Reverend Bell." The old man crossed the porch faster than Caleb expected. He opened the door wide and guided them inside without another question. The cabin was warm with the smell of cedar smoke, coffee, and wool blankets. A small fire burned in the stone fireplace. Caleb helped Daniel onto a couch, while Reverend Thomas Bell brought towels and a quilt. Ranger climbed onto the rug beside Daniel and pressed his body against the couch, refusing to move even when the old man set down a bowl of water. Caleb removed the wooden box from his back and checked the letters. The edges were damp, but the names remained readable. Reverend Bell looked at them and closed his eyes briefly. "He wrote those every night," he said. "Never mailed one." "Why not?" Caleb asked. He could remember the people. He could not always remember where they belonged. The Reverend knelt beside Daniel and felt his forehead. "You should have told me the cellar was flooding." Daniel gave a weak smile. "You would have tried to come down there yourself, and I would have complained the entire time." Reverend Bell turned to Caleb. "There is a landline in the kitchen. It works when the weather permits. Call the county rescue station. Tell them we have a man who needs medical care, but he is awake and breathing." Caleb made the call. The connection crackled, but a dispatcher answered and promised to send help by the northern road. When Caleb returned, Daniel was watching Ranger. The shepherd had rested his head on Daniel's knee. One of Daniel's hands lay between his ears, moving slowly through the damp fur. "He found you in Tennessee," Caleb said. Daniel nodded. "Every morning for 6 days. Same place by the fence." "You recognized him?" "Not at first. His eyes stayed on Ranger. But my hands did." Caleb sat in the chair across from him. The fire snapped softly. Rain moved against the windows in silver lines. "Why did you send him for me?" Daniel asked. "I remembered your voice before I remembered your face. I remembered you saying nobody gets left behind." Caleb looked down at the identification tag still in his palm. "I said that a lot. You meant it every time. Except once." Daniel lifted his eyes. "No, you followed an order once. That is not the same as choosing to leave someone." Caleb's jaw tightened. It felt the same for 7 years. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he raised 2 fingers and drew them gently toward his chest. The old hand signal. Ranger stood at once, stepped forward, and pressed his head against Daniel's heart. Daniel closed his eyes. The room became still. Caleb watched the shepherd breathe with the man he had carried through memory for nearly half his life. When Daniel finally looked at him again, there was no accusation in his face. Only exhaustion, gratitude, and something that looked almost like peace. "You came back," Daniel said. Caleb looked at Ranger. "He made sure I did." Outside, the storm began to weaken. The rain softened against the roof. Somewhere far beyond the cabin, St. Michael's bell gave one final note, low and clear, as if the mountain itself had heard the promise completed. 3 months later, winter released its hold on the Blue Ridge Mountains. Snow remained in narrow shadows beneath the pines, but the first green shoots had begun to rise along the creek, and sunlight returned to St. Michael's Chapel in long golden bands. The western wall had been reinforced. The flooded cellar had been drained and sealed. New cedar boards covered the floor where Caleb had once knelt with a warm identification tag in his hand, listening for a voice beneath the darkness. The chapel no longer looked abandoned. Fresh white paint brightened the window frames. The old blue glass had been cleaned, though Reverend Bell insisted that every crack remain visible. "A repaired thing should not pretend it was never broken," he said. Caleb understood. He spent most mornings repairing the pews and most afternoons helping volunteers carry supplies from town. The black metal case remained in his truck for the first week. On the 8th morning, he placed it inside a drawer in the minister's room. He did not throw it away. He did not display it. Some memories did not need to be worshipped or hidden. They only needed a quiet place to rest. Daniel recovered slowly at the Veterans Hospital in Asheville. His strength returned before his memory did. Some mornings he could name every member of Patrol 17. Other mornings he stood at a window and could not remember the road that had brought him there. Caleb visited twice each week. He never corrected Daniel too quickly. He learned that memory returned best when it was welcomed, not chased. Ranger remained beside Daniel through every appointment. The German shepherd slept beneath the hospital chair, walked calmly beside the rehabilitation staff, and lifted his head whenever Daniel's breathing changed. Nurses began leaving a water bowl near the entrance. Patients who rarely spoke reached down to touch the shepherd's sable coat as he passed. Ranger accepted every hand with the same grave patience, as though he understood that some people needed proof that gentleness still existed. By early spring, Daniel could walk short distances with a cane. The first place he asked to visit was the chapel. Caleb drove him up the mountain on a clear Saturday morning. Ranger sat between them in the truck, looking from one man to the other whenever the road curved. At mile marker 17, Daniel asked Caleb to stop. They stood beside the bent sign where Ranger had first waited in the rain. Wind moved through the young leaves. Daniel rested one hand on the shepherd's back. "He knew you would stop," he said. Caleb looked toward the road. "I almost did not." "But you did." Ranger stepped toward the woods, then turned back as if inviting them to follow once more. This time, no. One was afraid of where the trail might lead. St. Michael's opened that afternoon as a refuge for veterans and retired service dogs with nowhere else to go. There were no speeches from politicians and no cameras from the city. Only folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, homemade bread, and people who understood that healing rarely arrived with applause. Reverend Bell offered a short blessing. Daniel placed the wooden box of letters on the altar. Caleb had helped him find every family. Some letters had already been delivered. Others would take more time. None would remain forgotten. Near the chapel entrance hung a simple wooden plaque. Caleb had carved the words himself. No one is left behind here. Beneath it, 2 identification tags rested on separate hooks. One was the tag recovered years earlier and kept inside Daniel's memorial case. Its surface was darkened by age and fire. The other was the tag Ranger had drawn from beneath the pew. Its edges were scratched, but the letters remained clear. When sunlight passed through the blue window, both pieces of metal shone with the same quiet light. Daniel stood before them for a long time. "Which one is mine?" he asked. Caleb moved beside him. "Both." Daniel considered this, then smiled faintly. "That seems unfair. You had 2 lives waiting for you." Ranger settled between them and rested one paw on Caleb's boot. Daniel raised 2 fingers and gave the old signal. "Come." The shepherd rose, stepped forward, and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Caleb placed one hand on Ranger's shoulder. For several seconds, the 3 of them stood beneath the wooden plaque while the chapel filled with the soft sounds of conversation, paws against cedar, and cups being set on tables. No one spoke of miracles. The word felt too large for what had happened and too small at the same time. Late that afternoon, the visitors left. Reverend Bell walked down to the cabin. Daniel remained inside, reading names from the old photograph. Caleb stood on the chapel steps while Ranger watched the trail. The sky had turned pale gold above the mountains. Daniel came outside and took hold of the bell rope. "Do you think it was instinct?" he asked. Caleb looked at Ranger. The shepherd's amber eyes reflected the last light of day. "Maybe. Or grace." Caleb listened to the wind moving through the trees. "Maybe those are not always different things." Daniel pulled the rope. The bell rang across the valley, clear and warm. Ranger lay down between the 2 Marines, his head resting on his paws, finally no longer searching. Some prayers never arrive as voices from heaven. Sometimes they wait beside a lonely road, walk patiently through the rain, and lead 2 lost souls home.